Okay. All right. So, hi, everyone. I'm Leanne Langer. I'm OpenComp's head of customer success and community. And just a big thanks to everyone who's joining us and watching us today. First, a note on our High Growth Matters community. Our community is a place for you, for founders, for CEOs, heads of HR, and folks who are just building the world's fastest growing companies. Our goal, of course, is the compensation success of all of our members, as well as your holistic success in growing your companies. And we want to help with all of that. So through our community, we connect members to other high growth experts, to folks that are experiencing similar challenges to help them build networks, and also to provide real-time answers to your real-time questions. And we provide access to always at your fingertips resources and education materials, with one of those being our very own Thursday Expert Ask Me Anything, which is why we're here right now. So without further ado, let's get started. And I'm super excited to introduce you to today's expert, Mr. Jason White, who is a senior compensation consultant from OpenComp. Jason, you want to say hi and introduce yourself?
Yeah, hey everyone, Jason White. I am a senior compensation consultant with OpenComp. I've been with OpenComp from the very beginning and have worked in the startup world in the compensation area for about 15 years now. And my focuses are primarily on executive compensation with an emphasis on equity compensation and incentive plan design. And I also do a fair amount of work with broad-based incentive and compensation benchmarking. So I'm excited to talk a little bit more about the exec comp world today.
Yes. So thanks for introducing today's topic, executive pay with a pay equity lens. Very excited to dig into this. So Jason, there's this perception that managing executive pay is a lot more complex than how one would manage compensation for other job levels within the organization. And I know that when I was in-house and managing comp, I would always have this kind of feeling of dread, when the executive comp or the exec pay reviews came around. Can we start by talking a little bit about that? Like, why is there this perception of complexity around executive pay?
Yeah, there is a perception. I don't know if it's accurate. And obviously, you're dealing with numbers, maybe a zero or two extra on that number. But in general, I think that perception is because executive comp really versus broad-based comp, it really spans a very wide range. You may have on an executive team, for example, a VP of a certain function that maybe came from a large company and negotiated a very high cash package. And you might have their peer who's a VP as well, who maybe is new to the role. And the two of them might be making very different amounts, which you generally don't see if you're looking at like a career level individual contributor. And the second factor there with executive pay is that typically a very large portion of total compensation is delivered through equity. So it becomes a bit opaque when you start looking at equity, particularly in the startup world, because it's not always easy to assign a dollar value to the equity. So because of these factors, exec pay can be a little bit more complex, but in general, the same principles that we apply to administering broad-based pay apply to executives as well.
You mentioned something really interesting. So going back to that concept of equity as a dollar value, how do companies consider getting to that dollar value, particularly pre-IPO companies who don't have, a set daily valuation? And also generally, at which stage do companies start thinking about utilizing equity as a dollar value as their benchmark data point?
Yeah, good question, Leanne. We see companies evolving from that percent TSO towards that dollar value as they look at equity. It's really based on a few factors, of one of which you mentioned is really the stage of development. I'd say a later stage company, once you get maybe to your fourth or fifth round of funding, Another marker might be company size once you get north of 250 headcount. But really what frames it is when the company gets to a point where there's a tangible dollar value on what that stock is worth. And obviously a very early startup, you're issuing options, your strike price is pennies, you've no idea what that might be worth. But as companies mature and hit these milestones in terms of funding and size, they tend to get noticed from the outside community, and it's more quantifiable, their stock price. And that's the point at which companies say, okay, well, we have all this survey data on what an executive should be compensated in terms of a dollar value. Let's start using that to pay our executives.
Mm-hmm. And when a company makes that shift from the executive lens, are they typically doing that throughout their entire organization?
Yes. Yeah. Typically, when you switch over to dollar value, you do so for the whole organization. Mm-hmm. And a lot of companies, once they move to that dollar value, they start also maybe shifting from using stock options primarily to restricted stock units, which essentially it's a full value share. Mm-hmm. And that companies like to do that. It's popular with boards and investors, because once you start looking at full value shares, it takes fewer shares to generate a certain dollar value. So in terms of dilution, it's seen as a great benefit on the parts of investors.
I love that you talked about the stage of transition from stock options to RSUs, because it's always a common question that folks have as to, what is the timing in which you do that, and what are the things that you think of, when you're trying to make that transition or considering making that transition. But that is a topic for another webinar, another AMA, which now I'm going to reserve your expertise for. Okay.
Okay, that's a good one. Yeah. Okay.
Cool. So as you're leveraging, equity as a dollar value, just as, your compensation philosophy or as your comp strategy, do you see this benchmark as a way to help for companies to help promote pay equity practices within their organization, or even more specifically within the executive levels?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a critical milestone that once a company passes, they're able to administer pay from a more equitable perspective. Once you kind of have you've nailed down what that dollar component should look like, then you can start to build in structure and processes into executive pay and broad-based pay that tend to minimize or even eliminate any pay equity issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's definitely an important consideration. You touched on this earlier with our first question, but there's this perception also that executive pay requires a different process for how it's managed. From your perspective, from your experience and your best practices, how should companies actually approach managing executive pay?
Yeah, I'd say it's really the same basic approach that you would take for a broad-based employee population, yet it's a little more labor intensive, a little more complex. Really, the thing with executive comp that's a bit more challenging is that not all roles are the same, right? Especially for a startup, say for example, the role of a CFO. Sometimes CFOs at earlier stage companies, they wear multiple hats. A lot of times they're in charge of HR, they oversee legal. So you really have to dig into each individual role and really understand the data, the market data, right? As to what that position is worth. So really the market analysis, it's interesting. You have multiple levels for, say, a software engineer, right? And for an executive, you might only have one level, but it's a more complex calibration for executives due to the nature of the role and how it might be different at organizations.
That makes sense. And so when we think about the process, it obviously also needs to start with data, like having a relevant data source for your organization. And then to your point, aligning your job roles with that data source. How are we calibrating the role within the organization to the role within the job architecture and the benchmark ranges that you're using? And then how do you take that calibration and apply a market analysis, actually bringing in those pay ranges for cash and equity and applying them to your different executives. So how each team member on the executive leadership team, how they're paid against their own market. And you can use that to then make your decisions in regards to any compensation adjustments that you might be considering.
Yeah, and you see this a lot in the public company arena. Where executive comp, it's highly structured, and obviously pay equity is really at the forefront for boards of directors of larger companies. So it's something that companies very willfully and purposely develop these executive pay structures that are going to minimize any pay inequities.
Yeah,
and it's something that it's starting to trickle down, as I see it in the startup world, but I think we still have some work to do on that front.
How do you know whether your executive comp data is a reliable source for information?
Well, that's a good question. Really, it's starting with the data set itself, right? We like to make sure that we're looking at the right companies in terms of who do we compete with, right? B, that we're looking at the right jobs. For example, a VP of engineering at an early stage startup, it might be a very different job than, say, a later stage startup. So those are some of the things that that I recommend people look at in evaluating a data source. But as long as you do have those two things mapped and you have a reliable number of data points in the survey, I think you're well on the way to being on the right track. And from there, it's just a matter of really drilling down on your particular role and benchmarking it to the survey. And that might involve, oftentimes for executives, the example I gave with a CFO that might be in charge of HR, it might involve taking a hybrid approach where we might look at both roles, and then come up with a market average for the particular job that we are benchmarking.
Yeah, that makes sense based on what you were saying before, just that there's nuances in the roles and responsibilities of an executive at a startup versus perhaps at a more mature organization. We're wearing multiple hats and so there is some gray area that we need to figure out how to manage.
Yeah. And the important thing with executive jobs, that's right, is that really it's dependent on the size of the organization. Executive comp is highly correlated to company revenue, which is very different from, say, if you look at a software engineer, you don't find too much of a huge difference between an earlier and a later stage company for a software engineer. Might be a little bit higher for the later stage because they've got more cash, but you'd find a very wide gulf in executive compensation. So if you think of it, say I'm, the VP of engineering, a Series A company, right? Maybe I have 10 people reporting into me. Well, now we're Series D, Series E, I've got a team of 250 engineers underneath me. So you look at the scope of that job and, it's really easy to understand how the pay might be very different in those two examples.
Mm-hmm. So when a company is thinking about establishing their compensation philosophy, and again, specifically more so from the executive pay perspective, what should they be considering?
The most important thing to consider in executive comp is the pay mix. For broader based compensation, a lot of it's focused around the salary, the cash pay. But because executive comp, is highly leveraged with respect to equity, it's really an important consideration when you're looking at developing a comp philosophy to establish where do we want to be. Do we want to be an organization where we might pay less cash, but have a more potentially rewarding equity grants, or do we want to load up in cash and minimize equity? So there's a lot of things going on there. So it's difficult, and often it involves a lot of stakeholders, investors, the board of director, the CEO, obviously, to come up with something that's going to work for the organization. A lot of times also it's reflective of the company culture. You might have more of a risk-taking, executive suite where there's a high emphasis on equity and very low cash, or it might be the other way. So it's really catered and unique to the company, that comp philosophy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Like, what are the strategic business objectives for the organization? What behaviors are valued? Like you said, what is the company culture, the mission, the vision, and what ultimately is going to drive the behaviors to continue to grow the organization?
Yep.
So that makes sense. How often should executive pay be assessed?
Well, for some of my clients, it's it's a couple of times a year, but I would recommend at the minimum doing that annually. It doesn't necessarily have to be in conjunction with the broader comp review, and a lot of times it coincides with the compensation committee or a board meeting. But typically, that's going to be an annual cycle.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, that's what I've typically done as well. An annual review for the executive team. And I've typically done the executive review separate from the rest of the company, doing it in advance of the rest of the company and kind of getting the executive set and then looking at the broader organization.
Right. Yeah. And a lot of times the executive pay program kind of, the rest of the organization follows philosophically from what's being done with the executives.
Yes, exactly. And so I guess going back to philosophy, actually, and bringing this full circle in terms of pay equity, one approach, sort of like an initial step that companies can take to help move the needle forward in their pay equity initiatives, is taking the position that we don't negotiate offers, right? For any job candidate, we are putting forth our best and final offer to make sure that our new hires come in at the same starting point, right? And that somebody does not get a compensation advantage simply because they asked for more or because they have better negotiating skills. Do you think that this is something that's possible on the executive pay front?
I think it certainly is. It's something that public companies do routinely. So I see it certainly as a attainable goal for pre-IPO companies. The challenges come with, again, the executive team. Even though we might have the same title, right? You and me, we might both be VPs. Our experience levels might be very, very different, and the criticality of our role to the organization might vary as well. So it's a little more nuanced, and it's would be difficult for an earlier stage company to say, okay, all VPs are going to look like this, but rather it might be segmented by, there's a VP of technology or engineering, the pay might look like this, or a VP of, say, finance or HR might look like this. So it certainly is possible, to build out kind of a structure where there's no longer negotiation. Yeah, I see it as an attainable goal.
Mm-hmm. What are some other best practices that you've come across when it comes to, moving that needle on pay equity for executives?
Well, it's really starting to narrow down, right? You might not put a stake in the ground and say there's no negotiations, but it's really narrowing that scope. in terms of what a pay range looks like for cash and equity. So, you might kind of take a look at market data and say anchor it, between the low at the 25th percentile and the high at the 75th, and then kind of triangulate what the pay offer might be somewhere in between there. So that's a good start that we recommend doing, rather than just kind of having a blank piece of paper every time there's an offer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you brought up a really interesting point earlier about how the philosophy that you set for executives helps drive the philosophy for the rest of the organization. And both of those should really be in sync. So as companies think about pay equity initiatives within their organizations, making sure that what we're driving across the organization, really is showing itself, whether it's executive pay or non-executive pay.
Yep. Agreed.
So just take it back. What are some of the top questions that you get asked from your clients around executive compensation?
That's a good question. I think one of the main ones is really around, when do we start to pivot our compensation approach to look more like a mature or even a public company, right? That's probably the number one question that I get is, when do we move from like this startup model, which, is generally low cash, a lot of equity, but the equity is kind of hard to value. When do we move from that to more of a mature model where we have, reasonable market-based cash, we have performance-based bonus plans in place, and we have more regular annual equity grants? And I think the answer to that is if you're asking that question, it's probably hard to think about it. You're getting there if you're asking the question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you're asking the question, there's obviously a reason or something that is driving you to even think in that direction of maturity.
Yeah, and I'd add to that, probably one of the other questions that we're asked about is around equity refresh, right? Is when to give executives an additional grant of equity, and that's sometimes a complex and kind of a loaded issue. But I think it's something that companies they want to know that they're spending equity correctly, that they're not kind of just overspending on equity. So they, on the one hand, they want to make sure they're not doing that, but on the other hand, they want to make sure that they've got equity in place to retain the executive team. So it's really a battle between conserving shares and lowering dilution, but also providing enough glue to keep the team in place.
The ultimate challenge, balancing that competitiveness with your burn. So what trends, Jason, are you seeing in the future of executive comp?
One of the trends that I'm seeing that's trickling down into pre-IPO, typically later stage IPO, is performance-based equity grants. And these are very, very common in public companies. I think more than 70% of the S&P 500 has at least some form of performance-based equity. And these grants are different than, say, the option that I get that might vest over, say, 4 years. These are grants that have performance hurdles attached to them. And if the company doesn't meet these hurdles, I don't get anything. So for public companies, they're extremely popular because the executives don't get a dime unless the shareholders are rewarded. And a lot of times they are tied share price goals. Public companies do it. But I think what I'm for companies that are later stage It's not, I've only maybe seen 8 or 10 of these, but I think it's something that we're going to see kind of increase in prevalence here over the next couple of years.
And for the increase in prevalence, is it due to an increase in pay for performance, as a general compensation philosophy? Is it in response to balancing competitiveness with burn, making sure that companies get the bang for their buck? Where do you think this trend is brewing from?
I think it's brewing that in general, investors in a lot of technology companies, it's not a case where it was maybe 6-8 years ago, where they write the check and then they forget about you or check in every year. I think now there's more accountability when you have investors to see performance, and they want to see a return on the money that they've invested. So I think it's being driven by that mentality primarily, and a lot of the investors also kind of work or on boards of public companies. So they're used to seeing these plans. And, I think in their minds, it's like, well, if it works at a public company, let's try to make it work at a private company.
Mm-hmm. How do you apply it with some nuances?
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Well, Jason, one last question, because we're basically at time. If you could give one recommendation or one best practice that would change the exec comp game today for our members, what would that be?
I would say to start now, to dig in, to start looking at benchmarking, to get as much data as you can, to track equity, to kind of, overlay a sense, and even if it's not very formal, but some sort of structure onto executive comp. The earlier you can start looking at it from a big picture and quantifying it, the easier it gets to administer, later down the road. So I'd say it's never too early to start kind of, putting exec comp under the microscope.
Yeah, I love that. It's a good point. The sooner you get started, the more comfortable you get with it, the more data that you have under your fingers. Oftentimes with exec comp, you're looking at multiple data sources. So seeing how the data sources compare and how you create a hybrid target, it's the more knowledge that you have, the more comfortable you get. So
exactly. Yep.
That's excellent. Awesome, my friend. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I can't wait to bring you back.
Yeah, I'll come back next time.
All right. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.